Have you ever wondered how many dreams get locked behind doors no one bothers to open? What if the girl cleaning your classroom at night could solve equations your professors still struggled with? This isn't a story about luck. It's about what happens when quiet persistence refuses to be erased. Stay with me, because once you meet Amamira Thompson, you'll never look at silent spaces the same way again. Some people enter Harvard through the front gates, others through the back doors, helped by legacy and wealth. But there are those like Amamira Thompson, who entered each night through the service corridor with nothing but a key card, a mop, and a dream she hadn't dared speak aloud in years. At 1:42 a.m., while the world outside slumbered, Amamira adjusted her faded work jacket and stepped into the cold marble hallway of Jefferson Hall, Harvard's prestigious science building. Her shift had begun an hour earlier, like every night. She swept through corridors of brilliance, dusting chalk-stained desks, wiping fingerprints off doors with names like Dr. Wren and Dr. Liu, emptying trash bins full of crumpled coffee cups and equations scribbled on napkins. The students barely noticed her. Most didn't look up. But she noticed them. The hurried steps, the tired arguments over proofs, the deep silence before inspiration struck. She noticed everything. Tonight, like many nights before, Amamira moved swiftly between classrooms. But when she reached room 3.24, the largest lecture hall in the building, something made her stop. A chalkboard hadn't been erased. Under the faint light of a desk lamp, it glowed, dense with handwritten formulas, elegant, sprawling, alive. She stared at it, frozen. A matrix optimization problem with a nonlinear constraint. Beautiful. Familiar. Her heart pounded, not with fear, but with an old hunger. The kind she had buried long ago. Slowly, reverently, she set down her mop. Her fingers trembled as she picked up a piece of chalk. She didn't erase the professor's work. Instead, she added to it, weaving her own thoughts into the dense structure, adjusting lines, introducing new variables. For her, it wasn't just math, it was music. Meanwhile, outside in the near-empty parking lot, Professor Elijah Wren cursed under his breath. He'd left behind his most important notes in 324, drafts for the upcoming Cambridge Symposium. 8 months of work. He couldn't risk them being misplaced. At 2:06 a.m., he re-entered the building, annoyed, distracted. He didn't expect anyone to be there. Yet light spilled from under the door of 324. He pushed it open, silently. What he saw made him freeze. A young woman, not a student, clad in a janitor's uniform, was at the board, her hand moving quickly, precisely. For a moment, Professor Wren simply watched. Her back was to him, but her body language was unmistakable, focused, absorbed, utterly at home in the world of symbols and abstraction she was building. The final constraint of his model, the part even he hadn't yet perfected, was being restructured right before his eyes, and it made sense. "What are you doing?" he asked, voice low. Amamira jumped, dropping the chalk. Eyes wide, she stammered, "I'm sorry, I wasn't touching anything. I promise. I was trying to understand." Professor Wren stepped closer, examining the board. "That's not a beginner's mistake," he said, narrowing his eyes. "Who taught you to think like that?" "No one," she whispered. "I used to watch lectures from the public library before I had to drop out." "Drop out from where?" "High school," she said, unable to meet his gaze. "Senior year, my mom got sick. I had to work. That was 7 years ago." Silence stretched between them, heavy and brittle. Then, unexpectedly, Professor Wren reached for the chalk she dropped. Slowly, he added a line beneath her work. Not correcting, continuing. After a few seconds, he said, "You were wrong on the friction coefficient, but only because you didn't know I added a constraint in yesterday's lecture." Amamira blinked. "You mean I was close?" "Closer than some of my graduate students," he said flatly. For the first time in years, Amamira felt something deep stir within her. He turned toward the door. "Tomorrow, 7 p.m., my office. Don't wear the uniform. Bring your brain." Then he was gone, and she was left alone with the chalk dust and a heart pounding with something dangerously close to hope. Tonight, she had not been invisible. Tonight, she had been seen. The next evening, at exactly 6:59 p.m., Amamira stood outside Professor Wren's office in Pierce Hall. Her hands were clammy despite the cold air. She wore the only non-uniform outfit she owned, a pale blue blouse and black slacks meant for job interviews that had never called her back. When she knocked, the door creaked open immediately. "Come in," Professor Wren said without looking up. She stepped inside. The office was smaller than she imagined, crowded with chalkboards covered in complex equations, towering bookshelves, and the faint scent of lavender and old paper. He motioned for her to sit. "I assume," he said, sliding a folder across the desk toward her, "you think this is a disciplinary meeting." She nodded nervously. "You did overstep," he continued, "but not in the way you think." He opened the folder. Inside, a single line of text on a sheet of paper. "If she still wants in, let her in." "What's this?" she whispered. "An unofficial recommendation," he said. "I've submitted your name to the Harvard Extension School, night program. Placement test is next month. A donor will cover the cost." Her mouth fell open. "Why?" she asked, voice cracking. Professor Wren leaned back. "Because," he said, "I've spent 20 years teaching privileged students who memorize without understanding. You, Amamira, see patterns. You question. You build." Tears burned at the back of her eyes, but she blinked them away. "You'll still clean," he said, almost matter of fact. "At least for now. But if you pass, you'll study more, clean less, maybe one day teach." She nodded, hardly trusting herself to speak. That night, after her shift, she returned to an empty classroom, opened her battered spiral notebook, and began to study. Alone, silent, driven. The first week, the building guards were curious. The second, they stopped asking questions. The third, they began leaving an extra light on for her. She worked until her fingers cramped and her back ached. She solved proofs whispered into the empty air. She traced graphs on the fogged glass of the windows. She sat in chairs too large for her dreams, but too small for her determination. On weekends, when her shift ended early, she sat in the Harvard yard, beneath the dim glow of library lights, reading borrowed textbooks under a frayed scarf. No tutors, no study groups, no encouragement. Just her. When exhaustion clawed at her, when loneliness threatened to drown her, she whispered her mother's old encouragement. "Keep going." Still, the isolation grew heavier each night. There were moments, too many, when doubt crept in. When she wondered if she was chasing a dream that was never meant for someone like her. When the polished faces and pressed shirts of the daytime students felt like an entire universe she wasn't allowed to enter. Some nights, the janitorial supervisors reminded her, not cruelly but firmly, that study time wasn't part of her shift. She smiled, nodded, and returned to scrubbing floors, only to sneak back later with her books tucked beneath her jacket. There were nights she fell asleep in empty classrooms, her face pressed against unfinished problem sets, only to jolt awake minutes before her next shift began. One night, as she scribbled notes under the harsh fluorescent light, a student passing by sneered, "A janitor doing calculus. Cute." Amamira kept her head down. She had heard worse. She turned the page and kept going. But the words lodged somewhere deep, a splinter she couldn't remove. Another night, she overheard 2 graduate students laughing in the hallway. Maybe she'll solve the Riemann hypothesis next, right after cleaning the toilets. Their laughter echoed long after their footsteps faded. By week 3, she hit a wall. Her mind blurred the numbers. Her body refused to cooperate. Her hands shook with fatigue, and tears she hadn't authorized slid down her cheeks. She slammed her textbook closed. The sound echoed through the empty lecture hall, like a judge's gavel on her dreams. "What am I even doing?" she whispered to no one. The mop closets, the service elevators, the silent cafeterias, all the spaces where she existed like a shadow, pressed against her memories. She remembered the teachers who had once said she was gifted. The acceptance letter to MIT she never got to use. The nights she watched online lectures from borrowed library computers, scribbling notes on the backs of recycled printer pages. And she remembered how quickly the world forgot her when she stopped being convenient. There was a time she believed potential was enough. Now she knew survival demanded more. It demanded invisibility, humility, an ability to dream without asking permission. Her phone buzzed, a message from an unknown number. Hard problems aren't solved overnight. Strong minds don't quit either. She stared at the screen. Professor Wren. Her chest tightened, but not from fear. She opened the textbook again. Her hand shook as she turned the page. And she began, line by trembling line, again. Each night became a quiet vow. I am still here. And some nights, that vow was the only thing she had. She whispered equations to herself like prayers. She folded logic into sleepless nights. She stitched theorems into the hems of her worn clothes. By the end of the 4th week, the lonely girl who mopped floors by day was gone. In her place stood a quiet, steady mind, sharpening itself against impossible odds. No one cheered. No one noticed. But somewhere deep inside, Amamira did. 31 days after that first hesitant knock on Professor Wren's door, Amamira Thompson stood outside room 5.01 of the Harvard Department of Mathematics. Today was the placement test. The hallway smelled faintly of coffee and worn books. Nervous energy crackled in the air. Groups of students clustered together, whispering theories and comparing last-minute notes. They wore crisp button-downs, carried sleek leather portfolios, and wielded pens that probably cost more than her entire month's salary. Amamira stood alone. Her second-hand backpack slumped against her shoulder. The soles of her worn shoes squeaked faintly on the polished floor. She tugged nervously at the sleeve of her one formal blouse. Pale blue, slightly faded, the same one she wore to job interviews that never called her back. No one noticed her. Or if they did, they pretended not to. Inside the room, 3 professors waited, seated behind a long oak table. Their faces were unreadable, their bodies still. At the center, Professor Wren sat, impassive. No smile, no sign of recognition, only the barest dip of his head when their eyes met, fleetingly. At precisely 9 a.m., the proctor emerged and called out, "Miss Thompson?" Amamira inhaled slowly, steadying herself, and stepped forward. The room was cavernous, lined with ancient chalkboards and tall windows. At its center stood a single desk, hers. A thick test booklet and a simple pencil awaited her. No calculator, no internet, just her mind. "You may begin," the proctor said. She flipped open the booklet. The first problem hit like a punch to the chest. A nested matrix optimization, nonlinear constraints shifting dynamically across time variables. Complex, unforgiving. Amamira blinked. Read it again, and then a third time. Her hand moved to the pencil. Her grip was steady. She began to write. It came back to her. All those silent nights, crouched over cracked textbooks under flickering lights. The endless repetition. The whispered theorems. The quiet promises she made to herself. Keep going. She built the solution carefully, line by line, folding and unfolding matrices like origami, weaving logic and intuition into each step. Problem 3 came. Problem 5. Problem 8. Each one demanded more than calculation. It demanded clarity of thought under pressure. Around her, some students tapped their pencils nervously. One groaned softly, another flipped pages frantically. Amamira tuned it all out. Then came the final problem. Unlike the others, it wasn't asking for an answer. It was asking for insight. Explain why this structure matters. Explain why this chaos must exist before order can. Her chest tightened. This was philosophy hidden inside numbers. This was asking not for memorization, but for meaning. For a moment, the old voice slithered back into her mind. You're not supposed to be here. You're a cleaner playing dress-up among scholars. Her hand hovered over the blank page. Doubt thickened. And then, softly, stubbornly, another voice rose inside her. You were always the brightest thing in every room. Her mother's voice. Amamira pressed her pencil to paper. She wrote about complexity giving birth to simplicity. About how nested chaos could mirror the structure of resilience in life. About how true understanding wasn't about solving, but about seeing. She wrote not like someone trying to impress a board of professors. She wrote like someone who had fought tooth and nail just for the right to be in this room. 3 hours passed like a slow-burning fuse. When the proctor called time, Amamira rose carefully. Her back ached, her fingers were ink-stained, but her heart felt steady. She carried her test forward, set it gently on the professor's table, turned to leave. As she passed, she caught a muttered comment, sharp enough to cut. Even if she's decent, what does it say about our standards? Her spine stiffened. She didn't look back, didn't flinch. Professor Wren's voice followed, calm but hard as iron. It says we finally remembered what potential looks like. The door clicked shut behind her. She didn't cry, didn't smile. She just kept walking. 3 days later, a white envelope slid under the door of her tiny rented room. For a long time, she stared at it, afraid to hope. Then, with trembling fingers, she tore it open. Congratulations, Miss Thompson. You have been accepted into the Harvard Extension Program for Mathematics. Full tuition awarded. Below the printed words, a handwritten note. You didn't just pass. You outscored every applicant. Amamira sat down on the floor, the letter clutched to her chest. She laughed then, a breathless, astonished sound, half sob, half celebration. No banners, no applause, no news headlines. Just her. Breathing, fighting, winning. She had crossed an invisible line, the one they said she would never cross. And this time, no one would push her back into the shadows again. The first day Amamira walked into Harvard as an official student, no one held the door open for her. She didn't expect them to. She noticed everything: the sleek laptops, the designer backpacks, the casual arrogance of those who had never questioned if they belonged. Amamira carried a second-hand canvas bag, frayed at the edges. Inside were her spiral notebooks, a calculator with a cracked screen, and a worn scarf her mother had knitted during hospital stays. She found a seat in the back of her first class, Applied Structures in Nonlinear Mathematics. The professor, Dr. Monroe, swept into the room 2 minutes late, his glasses perched on his nose, his voice sharp and efficient. "Welcome to the hardest course you'll take this year," he said. "If you're here to be comfortable, you're in the wrong department." Some students laughed. Amamira didn't. She opened her notebook and underlined the course title like it was scripture. The first assignment came fast, a group project. Students shuffled into clusters, gravitating toward friends or familiar faces. When the pairings were announced, Amamira ended up with Jason, clean-cut, top of the class, a permanent smirk on his face. Jason glanced at her, raised an eyebrow, and said, not bothering to lower his voice, "Sorry, I think there's been a mistake. That's the janitor, right?" Snickers rippled around them. Amamira said nothing. She didn't need to. She opened her notebook, flipped to the problem set, and began working. Jason ignored her suggestions, refused to look at her calculations, dismissed her corrections. 3 days later, when the groups presented their solutions, only one group, hers, solved the final problem using a recursive reduction model that cut the solution time in half. Dr. Monroe stared at the projection, then asked, "Who solved this?" Amamira raised her hand. A murmur went through the room. Monroe peered over his glasses. "Try not to make the rest of us look bad," he said dryly. Some chuckled. Jason turned beet red. Amamira simply underlined the next assignment in her notebook. But success didn't erase the isolation. She sat alone in the cafeteria, studying between shifts. She scribbled notes in the corner of the library, flanked by students who looked through her, not at her. She walked home past the same marble halls she once mopped, her steps heavier on nights when exhaustion and loneliness pressed down like stones. Some nights she thought about quitting. But then she pulled out her mother's letter, folded carefully between pages of her notebook, and read it again. "You are always the brightest thing in every room. Keep going." She kept going. 2 weeks into the semester, Professor Wren stopped her in the hallway. "Walk with me," he said without preamble. They walked in silence past the lecture halls. Finally, Wren said, "You've made a stir." She raised an eyebrow. "Jason filed a formal complaint," Wren said, lips twitching with something that wasn't quite a smile. "Said you humiliated him." Amamira shrugged. "By existing." "By existing," Wren confirmed. "I told the board the math speaks louder than hurt feelings." That night she stayed after class to tackle an optional problem Monroe had posted. A variant of the classic Ramsey theory, modified with a time-dependent matrix. It was unsolved. Designed to be unsolved. Students glanced at it, scoffed, logged off. Amamira stayed. She stayed past midnight, grappling with the tangled logic. Stayed past 2 a.m. when even the janitors, her former co-workers, had gone home. By dawn, her fingertips were chalk-streaked. Her notebook was a battleground of crossed-out proofs. But she had found something. A pattern no one else had seen. She rewrote the entire proof, folding time states into a harmonic structure, creating coherence out of chaos. At 5:47 a.m. she submitted it. 2 days later, her phone rang. "Professor Wren. Reviewed your proof," he said bluntly. "So did Monroe, and Liu, and Zhang." A long pause. "They found no flaws." Amamira pressed her hand against her chest, steadying her breath. "But," Wren added, voice tightening, "Jason filed another protest. Claimed you couldn't have produced work like that. Said someone like you must have cheated." The words hit harder than she expected. "Someone like you." "I have all my notes," she said quickly. "Every draft, every timestamp." "I know," Wren said. "I already submitted them to the review board." Silence, then softly, "You didn't just solve the theorem, Amamira. You reminded us why we started teaching in the first place." A week later, the official verdict came back: valid, original, confirmed. The math department posted it publicly: problem solved by A. Thompson, March 15, 5:47 a.m. No fanfare, no parade, just truth. Dr. Monroe handed her a sealed envelope after class. "Not many people earn one of these," he said gruffly. "Don't waste it." Inside was a letter of recommendation for any graduate program in the country. Outside by the reflecting pool, Jason waited for her. "Still think you belong here?" he asked, smirking. Amamira opened her notebook, showed him the pages filled with messy, brilliant logic. "No," she said, calm and clear. "I don't think I belong here." She smiled, slow and fierce. "I earned it." Then she turned and walked away. Not fast, not triumphant, steady, like someone who knew the fight was never about being accepted. It was about never asking permission to exist again. At Harvard, nighttime felt different. The crowds were gone. The busy voices, the polished ambition, all melted into silence. What remained was the soul of the place, the smell of old books, the creak of ancient floors, the soft hum of possibilities. It was here in the quiet that Amamira Thompson finally found where she belonged. 2 weeks earlier, an unexpected email had arrived. "The Advanced Recursion Seminar needs a substitute instructor. Professor Wren has recommended Miss A. Thompson to lead Thursday's session. Please confirm availability. No fanfare, no committee vote, just trust." And so, on a chilly Thursday afternoon, Amamira walked into room 2.14. The same room where, years ago, she had cleaned floors in silence and studied scraps of math left behind by others. But today she wasn't carrying a mop. She carried chalk. Some students recognized her immediately. Whispers floated. "Wasn't she the janitor? Is this a joke? She's not really a professor, is she?" Amamira heard it all. She smiled quietly, picked up the chalk, and wrote 5 words on the board. "What patterns do you miss?" Then she turned to face them. "I'm not here to throw formulas at you," she said, voice steady. "Recursion isn't just about solving problems. It's about noticing, seeing what others overlook. It's about life too." The room shifted uneasily. A few exchanged skeptical glances. She didn't flinch. For the first time, she told them a piece of her story. How she had once mopped these same floors. How she studied equations no one thought she could understand. How life didn't give her easy choices, only hard paths and harder perseverance. Not for pity, for perspective. Because recursion wasn't just numbers looping over themselves. It was hope looping back after every failure. It was starting again, even when the world said you couldn't. By the end of the session, something had shifted. Not everyone clapped, but enough did. Real, honest, quiet recognition. That night, back in her small apartment, Amamira realized something. The classroom wasn't just hers to teach, it was hers to open. So she started the midnight mentorship sessions. No formal invitations, no flashy posters, just a handwritten note on the department bulletin board. "If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever doubted you belong, come study with us. Thursdays, room 214, midnight." The first night, 5 students came, 2 janitors, 1 single mother, a graduate student on academic probation, a cafeteria worker who dreamed of engineering school. They brought worn notebooks, battered dreams, and too much coffee. They worked under the hum of old projectors, solving problems together, whispering encouragement over crumpled papers and late-night yawns. Each session, more came. Not because they believed in themselves yet, but because someone else did. Amamira didn't lecture much. She asked questions. She listened. She let silence be part of the learning too. One night, after a session, a girl named Marisol stayed behind. "Miss Thompson," she said hesitantly, "how did you know you were good enough to teach?" Amamira smiled, soft and tired. "I didn't," she said. "I just kept showing up anyway." Marisol blinked as if memorizing the words. Hope lit quietly in her eyes. It wasn't about being certain. It was about being willing. The midnight mentorship became a quiet movement. Not official, not celebrated, but real. Students who once sat silently at the back of lecture halls now leaned over chalkboards, debating proofs with each other. Janitors solved matrix problems. Single moms cracked calculus barriers. People who had once been invisible began to take up space, unapologetically. And through it all, Amamira stayed steady. She never forgot who she had been. The girl who mopped floors and studied discarded theorems in the dead of night. She honored that girl every time she handed out chalk and said, "Show me what you see." She knew now that true teaching wasn't about who listened to you. It was about who dared to believe because you spoke. No Harvard headline ever announced it. Former janitor changes department culture. There were no banners, no viral videos, just small, steady ripples in the dark. One night, after the last mentorship session of the semester, when everyone else had gone home, Amamira stayed behind in room 2.114. She picked up a piece of chalk, the same kind she once feared to touch, and wrote one quiet line in the corner of the board. She stayed so we could begin. Then she set the chalk down, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the night. Her steps were steady, not because the journey was finished, but because she now carried something stronger than fear. A light she had kept alive and quietly passed on. And somewhere, beyond the quiet, others were already reaching for it. One night, after the last mentorship session of the semester, when everyone else had gone home, Amamira stayed behind in room 2.14. She picked up a piece of chalk, the same kind she once feared to touch, and wrote one quiet line in the corner of the board. She stayed so we could begin. Then she set the chalk down, turned off the lights, and stepped out into the night. Her steps were steady, not because the journey was finished, but because she now carried something stronger than fear, a light she had kept alive and quietly passed on. And somewhere, beyond the quiet, others were already reaching for it. There are people whose names are never etched into stone, but their courage, quiet, stubborn, unseen, builds bridges for others to cross. Maybe real greatness isn't about being noticed. Maybe it's about staying long enough to open the door for someone else. If you've ever doubted yourself but kept moving forward anyway, comment 1 if you believe that quiet persistence can change a life. Comment 2 if someone once believed in you when you almost gave up. And if stories like this resonate with you, don't forget to subscribe for more true, quiet victories we all need to hear.